So last week we discussed the work of Rudolf Otto, in which he discussed the mysterium tremendum. This God is a great mystery, tremendous mystery. And Otto stressed the idea of the holy as being something totally in the world of the irrational. It's not irrational necessarily, but super rational, something that philosophy will never get you there. Today we're going to start with another author by the name of Mircea Eliade, who wrote a book called The Sacred and the Profane. In this book, Professor Eliade distinguishes not between the rational and irrational, but he tries to understand the sacred as contrasted to the profane. And his view is that the sacred is attained not just by irrationalism or super-rationalism. The profane is also a rational act. It requires our thinking. He says, man becomes aware of the sacred because it manifests itself, shows itself as something wholly different from the profane. What does this mean? We say in the Psalms, Hashamayim esaprim kavod el. The skies, the heavens declare the glory of God. If you take a secular scientist and he looks at the sky, he doesn't see the glory of God. He sees the sky. He sees stars. He's an astronomer. He's not interested in any theological point. But when a religious person looks at those very same stars, they speak to him, not with physical words, but there's something that happens that places the stars in a different dimension from simply the rational. So Mircea Eliade says the sacred is something which doesn't exist out there. It exists within the mind of the religious person. Let's just take an example, a synagogue or a church or a mosque or any other sacred space that we call sacred space. What is it? It's a building. An architect will look at it and give the exact the dimensions of the building, the material that went into it, the style that went into it, et cetera, et cetera. It's a building like every other building. A religious person walks into the building and he or she says, oh, Ein Zekiim Bet Elohim, this is the house of God. I feel that this is a different territory. This isn't the same as just another building. This isn't just my apartment building. This is a sacred space. And so through our mind, we develop the concept of holiness, the sacred. He goes further. We are confronted by the same mysterious act, the manifestation of something of a wholly different order, a reality that does not belong to our world, in objects that are integral part of our natural profane world. In our minds, we live in a different dimension. We live in the rational, practical world, we do indeed, but we also live in a different world where we define things and see things with different eyes, with a different sense of what they are and what they signify. He goes through in this book, his book is called The Sacred and the Profane. He discusses different time and different places. So we discussed a little bit about the sacredness of a place like a synagogue, but also time. Like for us, we say the seventh day is Saturday. For us, it's Shabbat. It's not just Shabbat, Shabbat Kodesh, the holy day. We physically can feel the difference between Saturday and Sunday. If we're religious, Saturday and Sunday are not the same thing. They're not the same 24-hour entities. They're something entirely different. They live in a different experience. Why do we have that different experience? Because we feel, and not all, he's talking about all religions, not just Judaism, of course. We feel that somehow or other, these things are holy or sacred because they emanate from the gods, or in our case, the God. We sense in the physical thing or in our time that there's some link between God, this great creator, this great being, and the thing that the place or this time that we're in. And therefore, which interestingly enough, he points out in almost all traditions, the threshold plays a very important role. The threshold is a space between God, between the profane and the sacred. And in Judaism, where do we put the mezuzah? On the threshold, on the door. In other words, we recognize when you walk in the door, you're inside a sacred space, our home. When we walk outside, we're in the profane world. Not that the world's profane outside really, it's not totally profane, God is everywhere. But our sense, our sensitivity, our receptivity becomes more intense once we cross that threshold. So that's why it's very interesting that the Judaism and many other religions have made this threshold a very important religious symbol, because it's a reminder to us that there are different dimensions of reality, the dimension of the sacred and the dimension of the profane. Now, in ancient religions, going way, way back when, the so-called primitive religions, they believed that time was cyclical. There was no beginning, there was no end. Everything is just boo, 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 it just happens. And Mircea Eliade points out that the great chidush, the great innovation of Judaism, was to say time is not cyclical, but has order. He writes as follows: Judaism presents an innovation of the first importance. For Judaism, time has a beginning and will have an end. The idea of a cyclic time is left behind. God manifests himself not in cosmic time, but in historical time, which is irreversible. Now let's just talk about that more carefully. If God manifests himself in historical time, it means he's not just the God of nature, not just the God of the universe, not just the first principle, not just this nameless, eternal, holy being, but somehow relates to us. God has a whole universe, zillions of stars and planets and everything else to worry about. But somehow within our religious tradition, we believe God actually cares about us. Not only cares about us, he created us. He follows our existence. He listens to our prayers. There's a connection between God and us. It's not merely a philosophical relationship. It's an actual living human relationship. Oh, that's something very important. Time has a beginning and has an end. What does it mean, end? Well, we believe the end of days. What's the end of days? The Messianic days. The Messiah will come, the world will live peacefully, etc., etc. And we'll discuss Messianism in some other lecture. But the idea is that life doesn't keep repeating itself. History doesn't keep repeating itself, but there is a line, so to speak, from the beginning to the end. And that beginning to the end is guarded over by and has providential control over by this great God. There's a book that was written at the beginning of the 20th century by a psychologist by the name of William James, a very famous book called The Varieties of Religious Experience. And he discusses many points, and he tries to discuss not the philosophy of religion, but more or less the psychology of religion. And here's our problem. Our problem is, if you look at humanity from now and in the past, there are many people who feel a connection with God, but you don't know if they're nuts or if they're really serious. In other words, let's just take one of the stories we recently read in the Torah, the story of God coming to Abraham and saying, Abraham, take your son Isaac and go sacrifice him. All right, we read that with great reverence and solemnity and draw many theological points from that story. But what would happen today if we see a fellow in Central Park taking his son with a knife and he said, God came to me and said I should sacrifice my son. Now, what would we think? Would we think, well, this man really got a message from God? Or would we think this man is psychotic? There's something wrong with him. Wouldn't we stop him from doing this? The answer, well, William James plays with this problem. We have legitimate prophecy, which we'll discuss a little bit more in a little while. There's such a thing as legitimate prophecy. There's such a thing as God literally communicating with human beings. But it's very shaky to know who really got a real message from God and who is just a nut, just like believes he got a message from God. The other question that comes up is, in ancient times, there were these various priests and healers and shamans. Did they themselves believe that God came to them and gave them these powers, or were they fakes? So it's easy to say they were just fakes, but it's also easy to say, and I think probably more correct to say, they really believed that God gave them these powers. They believed somehow in their interpretation of things that God designated them and gave them certain ideas, certain medicines, certain rituals, which were going to be effective for their people. So it wasn't simply that they were trying to deceive the public, they were deceived themselves, at least from our point of view. In their point of view, they were real prophets. In our point of view, they were fakes, but not because they were bad people, but because they misunderstood or they mistranslated the message they think they got. And I mentioned this in a previous lecture, that there's a thing called the Jerusalem syndrome. And it exists today. Sometimes people go to Jerusalem and suddenly they start prophesying. This happens even today. You can check it up on Google if you want. Somehow or other, by just going into Jerusalem, they feel the Spirit of the Lord and they start prophesying. Are those real prophecies? Are they psychotic experiences? Are they neurotic experiences? I'm not a psychologist, I'm not going to evaluate. But all of us have a very fine line between our ability to determine this is really God's message, or this is simply my own imagination playing on me. We know from medical science that people can touch certain parts of your brain and evoke feelings and evoke thoughts, right? Different parts of our brain control different emotions and different things. You could hear voices. People who are schizophrenic, they actually hear voices, but it's not that these are real voices, but there's something going on chemically in their brain that causes them to hear these voices. William James says as follows. Here's what characterizes the life of religion. What characterizes religion in the broadest and most general terms, one might say, that it consists of the belief that there is an unseen order and that our supreme good lies in harmoniously adjusting ourselves thereto. So that's really the basic goal of religion. There is some order beyond what we physically see with our eyes. That is a reality which is so great and so true, we want to harmonize our lives with that reality. We want to live, so to speak, in the image of God. We want to live with the message of the Almighty and aware of the sacred in our world. He goes on and he discusses different people who had visions, etc., etc. And he says the thing in common between people who have these religious visions are two things he specifies in particular: a feeling of immense happiness. Religion, at its best, brings people incredible happiness. Even if they're suffering, they feel happy. And the other quality that he talks about is solemnity. People recognize, I'm not just happy in a silly or giddy way, I'm happy in a solemn way. I know that I'm in the presence of God. Interestingly, he draws, he says as follows: take the happiest man, the happiest person, the one most envied by the world, and in 9 cases out of 10, his inmost consciousness is one of failure. Either his ideals in the line of his achievements are pitched far higher than the achievements themselves, or else his secret ideals of which the world knows nothing, and in regard to which he inwardly knows himself to be found wanting. I mean, William James is a psychologist, and he studied a lot of people, I guess. And he says even people who seem to be very successful, very happy, if you just scratch the surface, they're not really happy at all. Unless, of course, they have this religious sense. That's another dimension here. But just other happiness, they're not really happy without this religious sense, of feeling a sense of transcendence, that their life has further meaning. What is the nature of religion, says William James? The sense that our life means something. In other words, let's say there is no God, chas v'shalom. But let's just say for the philosophical reason. Well, then why are we here? Why is a cow here? Why isn't a gorilla here? They're here. They live, they die, and that's the end of the story. And human beings are not any different from them in a secular sense of the term. In other words, there's no ultimate reason why we're here. There's no goal to which we should aspire. There's no ideal God to which we are answerable. We're just here, like any other beast, of any other living being that happens to inhabit the earth. What makes us human, so to speak? An awareness that our lives do mean something. Where does that meaning come from, says William James? It comes from a sense of the divine. We were created by God who wants us to be here. God has a purpose for us to be here. It's not just that we're here at random. It wasn't just a mistake of a million mutations suddenly created us. No, there's a real meaning to our lives. And that meaning comes directly from a divine being who put us here. Why did he put us here? He put us here for a reason: to fulfill ourselves and to serve him and to be righteous, etc., etc. And what's the goal? The goal is that there's a life after this world. When we die in this world, we're not simply like a cow that dies. We're human beings, a soul that dies, and there's some kind of eternity behind to look forward to, or not to look forward to if we've been not so good people. So the point of the matter that he stresses is that the belief in God is not only a source of happiness, not only a source of solemnity, but also the source of meaning. We mean something. We're not just random beings just inhabiting this world for 120 years, and then we disappear and that's the end of us. There's a goal for it. And he draws on the writings of Leo Tolstoy, the great Russian writer, novelist, playwright. And this is Tolstoy talking now. Since mankind has existed, wherever life has been, there also has been the faith that gave the possibility of living. Faith is the sense of life, the sense by virtue of which man does not destroy himself, but continues to live on. It is the force whereby we live. He goes on to say Tolstoy went into a Great Depression. And even though he's a great writer and famous and prosperous and had a wonderful family, etc., he felt meaningless. He said, what's all my money for? What's all my writing for? He felt very depressed. In other words, he felt like a failure. And that was what William James said before. No matter how great we think we are, we fall short. There's something more we should have attained, we could have attained, we might have attained. And the characteristic of a striving human being is, how could I do better? How could I do more? So then he says as follows. I remember one day, and this is Tolstoy again. I remember one day in the early spring, I was alone in the forest, lending my ear to its mysterious noises. I listened, and my thought went back to what for these 3 years it always was busy with, the quest of God. But the idea of God, I said, how did I ever come up with this idea? And again, there arose in me with this thought, glad aspirations towards life. Everything in me awoke and received a meaning. Why do I look further? A voice within me asked. He is there. He, without whom one cannot live. To acknowledge God and to live are one and the same thing. God is what life is. Well then, I live, I seek God, and there will be no life without him. Now, let's just analyze that. Okay, it's a very, very nice spiritual time that Tolstoy had. He was out privately in the forest. He had been depressed. He'd been wondering about meaning of life. And suddenly it just came to him that, there's a God. And that God gives me happiness. That God gives me meaning. And that's just fine. Now, my question is this. Was that a prophecy that Tolstoy received? Or was that simply an intuition that somehow came to him? Well, it's a rhetorical question, because I don't think it was a prophecy. I think it was something that could come to everybody. Somehow God is able to communicate to us, not by verbally saying, I am now calling on you to recognize that I am God, and I want you to have meaning in your life. We don't hear that voice too often. If we do, then we probably should see a psychiatrist. But somehow internally, I don't even like to use the word voice, but there's something within us that it didn't come through a rational process, but it came to us in some way. We came to a realization of something we didn't understand before. I keep going back to the analogy of music. You hear some gorgeous music and you feel transported, you feel very moved. You can't describe it in an intellectual way. I heard this and this note and these chords and this sonata, and therefore such and such happened in my brain, and I had such and such an emotion. That's not what really happened. What really happened was, I was lifted up. Something transformed me within me that I can't rationally describe. It didn't come from a rational source. Not that it's irrational, but it's something that's not quite definable. Now, I want to talk about prophecy, because prophecy is the greatest strength and the greatest problem for religion. Why is it the greatest strength? It's the greatest strength because if God cares about us and he actually speaks to us, whatever speak, we'll have to discuss what speak means, communicates with us, we'll say. God communicates with us. That's a phenomenal thing. We're not just nothing, little atoms floating around in space, but God, this great universal cosmic God, cares about us. He talks to us. He gives us a message. He tells us what we should do, what we shouldn't do. Wow, that's what a validation that is. If the president of the United States should call us and say, you know what, you're an important person, I love you, you're terrific, we feel validated. It's a wonderful thing. And let alone the president, who you could like him or not like him, but God you have to like, you have to love. And God comes to you and says, you're important to me. I'm glad that you're there. I created you for a purpose. Wow, that's phenomenal validation. We feel very good about it. So prophecy is a phenomenal thing, but it's also a danger. Why is it a danger? Because who's a prophet? Every nut who says, I heard from God is a prophet. Even in the Bible, we have the problem of distinguishing between true prophets and false prophets. If you read the book of Jeremiah, who was, of course, a true prophet, in his time, they didn't think he was a true prophet. They were going to kill him. Isaiah also. They were going to murder him. They didn't want to hear his prophecies. Prophets were not happy people. They suffered because they often had to go against the king. They had to go against the popular sentiments. They said, there's going to be destruction. You have to repent. You have to worry about the widows and the orphans. People didn't want to hear all their arguments and all their, thus saith the Lord. Who says you're telling the Lord? Who tells you? Why should we believe you? And there were many false prophets who also were prophesying just the opposite. And how could you distinguish between the correct prophet and the wrong prophet? So prophecy, which is really the foundation of our religion and Christianity and Islam too, for that reason, for that matter, we can't do without prophecy. On the other hand, if God speaks to us, how do we know it's God speaking to us? And how do we know that the person communicating that he spoke to God or she spoke to God is rational, is telling us the truth? How can we distinguish one thing from the other? Well, that brings us to Rambam. So in my book, it's on page 31. It's in the laws of the beginning section, chapter 7. It is a foundation of faith to know that God endows human beings with prophecy. Prophecy only takes hold on a sage who is very great in wisdom, strong in character, one whose evil inclination never controls him, but rather who is always in control of his inclination, a person of expansive knowledge and logical thinking. Now, here's the interesting thing. Rambam says he's a philosopher. In order to be a prophet, says Rambam, you first have to be a philosopher. Sorry for the phone there. You first have to be a philosopher. You have to be a person of rational qualities. You have to be a person who's totally righteous and a person totally in control of your emotion. Rambam thinks the ideal human being is also the ideal philosopher, a person who is wise, has total self-control, and is constantly focused on God and on the reality of God. Now, if you look at the Bible itself, you would not think that that's the definition of a prophet. We have prophets who are shepherds, prophets who don't seem to be particularly brilliant philosophers. But Rambam posits something new, that in Judaism before Rambam, this was not an idea. But now Rambam is more sophisticated. Rambam thinks if you let any shmo be a prophet, then how do you know that this shepherd is a real prophet or a fake? It's just too difficult. Prophecy isn't something that just comes randomly from God. Rather, a person has to earn it. It's like you go to get your PhD, you work very hard, and you have your oral examination, you write your dissertation, you finally get your doctoral dissertation, mazel tov, congratulations, you're a doctor, but you earned it, right? Hopefully, right? So there was no shortcuts. And so Rambam says there's a way to become a prophet. And there's you study, you reason, you contemplate on God, you know philosophy, you know physics, you know metaphysics. And when you reach a very, 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 very high level, you might get a touch from God, you're a prophet. But without those preliminary steps, you can never be a prophet, according to Rambam. And Rambam says this for a very rational reason. He's trying to secure prophecy as a basis of religion. Because once you say prophecy could fall on any human being, then any nut could come along and say, I just received the prophecy, and now you should do this, this, and this. God spoke to me, and I should kill people. God spoke to me, I should torture people who are heretics. Rambam wanted to preclude that possibility. As I say, Rambam had a very sophisticated view of God and a very, actually very intelligent view of God. But was it true to the actual spirit of Judaism? I'm not going to vouch for that, because there are plenty of people before Rambam and after Rambam who did not accept his definition of prophecy at all. But we like Rambam, so I'm a Rambamist on this. A person endowed with these qualities and also physically complete, when he enters the orchard, he cleaves to these profound and great matters. Let's talk about the orchard. The Talmud discusses 4 sages who went into the orchard. The orchard is the field of metaphysical truth. And what happens is they're trying to search for the ultimate truth. And what happened was one of them died. One of them lost his mind. One of them became a heretic. And only Rabbi Akiva went into the orchard and came back out alive and came out in peace. So what were they looking for? What was their problem? According to the Gemara, the problem was they saw the world and they said, let din v'let dayan. The world runs without justice. We see righteous people who suffer. We see wicked people who prosper. We see people in power who are not worthy of being in power. And we see people who are worthy getting tortured and living horrible lives. If there was a true God, these things wouldn't be happening. So one of them just lost his mind. He couldn't stand it. One of them died. And Elisha ben Abuya said, I don't believe in anything anymore. He left the fold. Rabbi Akiva entered the orchard and came out of the orchard. Why was he able to come out of the orchard? Did he have the answer? So my humble opinion is he didn't have the answer either. I don't think any of us is going to have the answer. But he learned how to live with questions. He said, yeah, you know what? It's beyond my understanding. I don't get it. But that's not going to shake my whole faith. I feel the presence of God. And even though sometimes things happen that I think shouldn't happen, and I wish God would intercede, I'm not giving up on what I know to be true intuitively from my faith. So he was able to live with that question, and we have to discuss it at greater length at some future time. But Rambam says that a prophet enters that orchard and comes back. That the prophet is able to go to the greatest mysteries of God, deal with all the perplexities of theology, and come out of that still whole, still with a perfect faith. If you have intellectual excellence, and you have moral self-control, and you've entered the orchard and come out in peace, then you have a chance to be a prophet. And he sanctifies himself and separates himself from the masses of people who walk in darkness of the mundane. He prods himself and reaches his soul to avoid even one thought about idle matters. That this prophet is really, really super, whose thoughts are totally pure and totally under control. And he doesn't bother with ephemeral nonsense, but rather keeps his mind always directed heavenward, linked to the divine. Then immediately the Holy Spirit rests on him. His soul then intermingles with the level of angels and he becomes another person. He realizes he is no longer the same as he used to be, but he has been elevated to a higher spiritual level. Now, if you look at all the books of the prophets in Judaism, well, we know Moses is the greatest prophet, so we're not going to argue about that Moses is number one. But if you look at the books of the prophets, you see, and Rambam notices this also, some seem to be very eloquent and very powerful, and some much less so. And Rambam says different people get different levels of prophecy. It's not all one thing. It's not that you're a prophet, now you're all the same as Moses. You're not. Moses was the number one prophet. Other prophets, they were arranged from 1 to 10. They're not all on the same range. And also sometimes people get a prophecy once in a lifetime, and sometimes people get a prophecy that lasts over a course of a number of years. So Rambam was very literarily sensible, and he sees our prophets as human beings who reached a very high level of personal perfection and who were able to draw divine inspiration either sometimes or a lot of times. Why does Rambam stress that Moses was the greatest of all prophets? In fact, one of the 13 principles of faith is that Moses is the greatest prophet. There never was one before him as great, and never one after will be as great as Moses. Now, okay, we like Moses. We're big Moses fans, but why make such a big fuss about Moses? And there's a logical reason for it. Rambam was living in a Muslim country, and what do the Muslims say? They say Muhammad came along and eclipsed Moses. And Christians say Jesus came along and he eclipsed Moses. Rambam says, you know what? No one eclipsed Moses. When God gave the Torah to the people of Israel, that was the ultimate revelation to humanity, the one and only, we might say, and everything else is false. The word false I use not in a pejorative sense, false from our point of view. They can believe it and they think it's true. I'm not arguing with other religions right now. But from the Jewish point of view, when God gave the Torah to the people of Israel, that was God's single revelation to an entire people. It wasn't a revelation to one person. It wasn't a revelation to one person who thought he was a prophet. It wasn't the words of some wise sage. It was a revelation to the entire people of Israel. And Moses, being the greatest prophet, can never be eclipsed. And therefore, everyone who comes afterwards, well, I'm a prophet and I'm starting a new religion. I have a new text. Your old Torah is outdated. Push them aside. They can't be telling you the truth. That's the foundation of faith, because without that foundation of faith, and then every 10 years, another religion will start. Not every 10 years, but every X number of generations, someone will say, I'm a prophet, and make a new religion. And it happened in Christianity also. You have the Mormons, you have every bunch of sects and all kinds of sects that grow up. And each one says, I had a prophecy, and they start something new. So Rambam says, you know what? There are prophets of various levels, but number one was Moses, and nobody could come to eclipse Moses. And then he asks, that's another point. Why do we believe in Moses? Because he did miracles? No. Interestingly, people say, Moses, why do you believe Moses? Because Moses was able to split the Red Sea. Rambam does not accept that. We believe in Moses for one reason, because our ancestors, and theoretically, according to tradition, our souls also, we were at Mount Sinai. We all got the message from God directly. We didn't need Moses. We each personally saw and experienced the revelation. So therefore, our belief is not because Moses did the miracle, therefore we believe in God. No, we believe in God because we ourselves saw God and we ourselves heard and experienced God at Mount Sinai. thousands, hundreds of thousands of people heard Mount Sinai, of our ancestors heard and passed that down. That's the source of our faith. So the Rambam goes on further. What is the difference in the prophecy of Moses and all the prophets? All prophets prophesied in a dream or a vision, but Moses prophesied while he was awake and standing upright. I don't know exactly what the quality of Moses was, but the Torah also emphasizes Moses spoke to God face to face, whatever that means. Moses, when you read the Torah carefully, he doesn't seem to have been a philosopher. He doesn't seem to be a genius. It's hard to figure his whole, we don't know all about his life, but okay, he was raised in Egypt. He lived as a shepherd for many, many years. He led the people out of Israel. If you read his words, he was very eloquent, even though the Torah says he was had difficult of speech. From reading the text, he didn't seem to have too much difficulty. He was actually quite eloquent and quite spirited and a great leader. But the quality that Rambam applies to Moses, we don't immediately see when we ourselves study the text.